Hello. This is the second of my discussions of experiences of working in international corporations. And today I want to talk a little bit about my period of time that I worked for a major corporation, GE. I worked for GE Healthcare, and my title was Global Pricing Director. Okay, so my responsibilities were around the world, and that got me traveling and working with folks all over, uh, from Malaysia all the way to Sweden and China and everything in between. So, a few things that I want to kind of talk about, and I'll try to do them a little bit in chronological order of what I noticed. Was the very first thing was um, that I traveled when I traveled to China the first few times. I traveled to Beijing, and a few real interesting things happened. What I found was that when I traveled to the other side of the earth, my productivity was super high. And the productivity, not just of me, but of my team, was super high. Why? Because of the time difference. And we think of the time difference as being something that, in many ways, is a hindrance. But here's the neat little thing that I had noticed. Okay. When I was in China and I was going to bed around 9 p.m. or something like that, it was as the workday was starting here in the United States. All right. Furthermore, while I was sleeping for 8 hours, my colleagues in Milwaukee were working their day shift. When I woke up early in the morning and I turned on my computer, my fellow colleagues had just left after a full day of work. So, what happened? Well, I was doing my stuff, right? And I was traveling. My kids weren't with me. My wife wasn't with me. Okay. I had stuff to do in our offices, people to meet, things to do, right? I went back to my hotel room, got the stuff done I needed to get done, and the things I needed questions for or needed somebody in Milwaukee to crunch some numbers. Okay. It worked out relatively well. So what I did was I sent an email before I went to bed and said, "Hey, colleagues, can you help me out? I need this. Please send it to me when you get it done." And then I went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, before I went to breakfast, I would open up my email and everything that I had just asked for before I went to sleep magically was in my inbox. Okay, because the 8 hours I was sleeping were actually very productive. Okay, so as a business traveler, okay, I was sitting there saying, "Wow, this is cool." Okay, but when I talked with my colleagues in the China office, they were a lot more frustrated with the time difference because they weren't waking up in a strange hotel in the mornings before breakfast, and they were not, uh, sending emails late at night before going to sleep. They had a thing called life that they were living, right? They had their family and their kids and so on and so forth. So their day really was uh, during a period of time where there really where headquarters, which for GE Healthcare is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is closed. So if you wanted to be in a Zoom meeting like this that we did very frequently, we would need to uh, schedule it so that it wouldn't be too bad in China and it would be reasonable in the US as well. And you know, it still meant that as a somebody working in the Chinese office, that frequently you had to wake up very early in the morning to do Zooms, or you needed to do them in the evenings when it really should be family time. Right. Okay. And for those of you who have been in the virtual study abroad program, okay, that we have been doing for the last 11 weeks, they had to wake up here in Texas and start at 7:15 a.m. every morning, because at that point it was 2 in the afternoon or 3 in the afternoon in uh, in Germany, okay, where Dr. Shamoris was lecturing out of. All right. And we had participants in India, which would have made that, dinner time. Right. And we also had occasionally um, uh, a representative from Taiwan. Right. So if you wanted to do one of these cross continent Zoom meetings, there's these time differences, right? And you just got to recognize it. And for workers in the various areas, it's somewhat of a pain, okay? But it turns out as a traveler, if you're staying in a hotel and, you know, and you've got a little extra time on your hands and you don't have any distractions like dogs and cats to feed and things like that, it actually added to the productivity. Right? Here, some of the big consulting firms, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and things like that, who put presentations together quite frequently, have in a global environment put the PowerPoint deck experts in India. First of all, the labor is cheaper there. Okay. But the neat thing is they can do the same thing so that at the end of the business day here, they can write their nice notes, their hand-drawn graphs of what they want their presentations to look like. They send it to India, and magically, the next morning, it's all been perfectly formatted by, the communications experts on the other side of the earth, right? One of the clients that I had in the previous job, the Simon Cooper and Partners, works for a very, very high, one of the clients was a very, very, very high end and very expensive software package that analyzed essentially, sonograms of the earth for, or radar of, the earth to try to figure out best ways to drill oil. Well, their clients were companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, etc. And because the software was so expensive, what these guys did was they handed that software off 3 times a day. So their engineers in Houston would work on it, let's say from 8 to 5 in the US, right? And then they would hand that off to the folks working in an office in Indonesia. I can't remember which way around the world it went. for the next 8 hours. And 8 hours after that, they moved that software and had somebody work with it in, in Singapore, right? And then after those 8 hours, that software was transferred back to the U.S. and people here worked on it for the next 8 hours. So this really expensive software was being utilized 24 hours a day across 3 offices across continents. All right. So timing issues are one of those things that are very, very interesting when you deal internationally. When you're dealing locally, it's not that big of a deal. Yeah, even in the United States, you got to be a little bit cognizant that, California wakes up 2 hours after we do, and we are 1 hour from folks on the East Coast. Okay, but when we go internationally, you got the same issues, except they're much bigger, right? It's a little bit or a lot more complicated. All right. The second thing that I'd like to talk about was a little bit of frustration with my colleagues and other typical foreigners that were with me going on trips. Okay. Now, China has some very, 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 very nice hotels, some 5-star hotels and things like that. So you can travel there as a business traveler and check into your Western style hotel. Okay. And most of the people who are in these Western branded hotels are other foreigners, others from your office in Milwaukee. Okay. It's kind of like a high-end slum, an American slum. Everybody there that you're interacting with in the hotel and your team members and so on and so forth, they're all in this bubble. They're transplanted Americans right in that hotel. My frustration was very, very few of my colleagues would venture out and just go walk in the streets. And if you walk the streets, you saw a very, very different China than if you were at a Marriott or a Hyatt hotel, which basically looks like a Hyatt here in the United States or a Marriott here in the United States. Right? If you went and you walked the streets, you really got the sense of what it's like in China. Okay. And if Americans are going to China, one of the things that they probably are, the reason their employer is sending them there is so that they get some interactions with their potential customers and coworkers and so on and so forth. And many, many, many workers, okay, just they don't feel comfortable to go outside of their comfort zone, and Western style hotels, that serve breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then you're off in the meetings and the meeting room. You can spend a week in China and never really get a sense of what China is like. So my strong recommendations to you is when you do travel, if you are traveling for business, make it a big point to get out and look to see what is going on, right? And the example that I used when I came back to explain this to my colleagues was one of the first trips I went there. I went wandering around the area that was near where the hotel was, which was primarily a residential area. In this residential area, there was a Coke machine. Yes, Coca-Cola is everywhere, right? Now, had I gone to our appliance people, GE appliances, GE made appliances. And I would have told them, look, we need to make a Coke coin operated Coke machine like we have downstairs, but it's going to be for the Chinese market. Can you design a Coke machine for the Chinese market? I can almost guarantee you that what will come out of our engineering shop here in the United States would be a scaled down Coke machine, okay, that was defeatured so that it could be produced as cheap as possible. Why? Because China isn't rich, right? Well, that's not what the Coke machines were that I saw on the streets in the residential areas of Beijing. These Coke machines were ultra modern with big LED displays in front, displaying advertising and all sorts of features. They were the fanciest Coke machines I at that time had ever seen. Okay. Our engineers would have completely missed that mark because of this predetermined thinking of, well, what is it that they want, and so on and so forth. It turns out the fanciest Coke machines could be found on the streets of Beijing in China. Okay. Now, we're fast forwarding 20 plus years later, and you start seeing some of the same innovations on Coke machines here, but I first saw them 20 years earlier in China. So you get some of this understanding if you wander around and you get a sense of how they live and the types of products they buy and so on and so forth. A couple other little things from China was the Chinese have a very strong entrepreneurial subclass who wants to become rich. We think of them as socialist communists, they care about the collective good, they're not in it for themselves. Yeah, that might have been, right? But two different things about being in Shanghai and Beijing at the time, right? The first one was these high-end department stores. It was a mid-level manager at GE. Some of the stores I went in, I could not afford to shop in. They were real high-end shops. Okay. Gucci and all the brands that you would see on Rodeo Drive were all being sold there. And guess what? It wasn't the foreigners that were walking around buying this stuff. It was the Chinese, right? So although your typical Chinese person doesn't have an awful lot of wealth, there is a definite subclass of these entrepreneurs that have made an awful lot of money. Anyways, while walking around one of these malls, there was a display that I think was a display of a work that middle school children had written about what they want to do in their lives, right? And it was real interesting as I was reading through these, there were a lot of people talking about how they really wanted to become an entrepreneur and be wealthy. And then you had a subset that really apologized for their career choices and saying, I know it would be better if I became a rich business person, but I really want to become a school teacher because I like working with, you know, with young elementary school teachers. So my goal is to be a school teacher, even though that's really not, it may be good for um, the kids, but it's not really a money making operation. And I know I really should be focused in on making money more than anything else. And I say, yeah, wait a minute, time out. Did we get our cultures mixed up here? Right. But you saw this was a period of time where China was really, really pushing for economic growth. Okay. Other things that I noticed in China is, and I took my wife there on a trip thereafter, was bullet trains. Okay. We took bullet trains where they were traveling 200 miles an hour. Right? Stuff that in the United States we can't afford. We're talking right now about an infrastructure plan. Okay, maybe we'll build one or two of these. The Chinese have built their whole system from one part of the country to another, which have been upgraded to 200-mile-an-hour trains. One of my former clients at the previous job that I had was the engineering firm that made a magnetically levitated train that basically floated on air. It was a German company. It was the German company I worked with. They were going to build this going to Berlin. It turns out the Germans never built it because it was too expensive. Where can you ride this? In Shanghai. They built it in Shanghai from the airport to the center, which is the airport is quite a ways away from the city center. And it's now being rebuilt further on. Okay, so some things in China are very, very different than what you would normally expect. Right. So those were some of the learnings that I had from doing business there. Let me go to Sweden. Sweden was kind of interesting in that Sweden is a very feminine country. Right. One of the best bosses I ever had was at GE. Ann O'Hara was her name, and she got promoted and was sent to our facility to help run the facility in Stockholm, just north of Stockholm. I think the town was Uppsala. Anyways, Ann is a great person, but she's a workaholic. She's one of these people that, for whatever reason, I never really saw her drink caffeine. But if you think of somebody who's amped up on caffeine 24 hours a day, constantly working, okay, it's Ann. Anyways, when she got to Sweden, okay, she ran into a really big problem there. And her really big problem was they wouldn't let her work. She was a vice president, right? And when she got there, she would get there, early at dawn and swipe her card to get into the building. And then she would leave like at 8 in the evening and swipe her card to go home as I mentioned, she was a workaholic. Right? After having been there for a few weeks, she gets a message from her boss and the union telling her that she was working more hours than was allowed and she needed to cut back her hours. The argument was twofold. One is you should be having a life outside of work. And if you are putting in the hours you're putting in, you are shortchanging your personal life. You need a better work to life balance, and we will not let you work those hours. Fine. Anne said, no problem, I will go home. So what happened was she took her laptop and she went home. 2 weeks later, they had the exact same conversation again. Why? Because they noticed when she was home, she took out her laptop and logged in to the databases. And they caught her working at home. And they basically told her, you cannot do this. And their argument was, it's not fair. Here in the US, if somebody wants to be a workaholic, let them be a workaholic, right? It's their lives. It's not the mentality that they had in Sweden. The mentality in Sweden was, if we let you in work those hours, yes, you're a vice president. And we have 4 other vice presidents in the building, 5 other vice presidents in the building, but we only have 1 executive vice president. When it gets time to promote someone to the executive vice president level, we will have you, who's a workaholic, and 3 others who have a healthy work-life balance. And who is going to have the competitive advantage? The person who has worked their tail off, or the 3 that have gone home after a good 5-hour day, 8-hour day. Who knows? In Sweden, it might be a 5-hour day. All right. Anyway, the argument was, if we let you work as hard and as long as you are working, it adds pressure on your colleagues to do the same, because otherwise you are going to get promoted and they aren't. And if they want to get promoted, they've got to compete with you. And we're not going to force them to work those hours, because we believe in, the Swedes believe in a work-life balance. And so we cannot let you work those hours either, because it doesn't just affect you, it affects everybody who competes with you to climb the corporate ladder. Okay? Very, very different thought processes that happen. Okay. So anyways, those are 2 illustrations of, what we did. Oh, well, I'll go back to China. Here's 2 more little tidbits. Okay. The first tidbit I saw was the Chinese love to drive Buicks, GM Buicks. Okay. Big SUVs. Interestingly, every single Buick I saw did not have automatic transmission. It had manual shifts. But other than that, they were the same luxury interiors that we would see in the US. And I kind of mentioned this a couple times to some of the colleagues that were in our offices in Shanghai, who were, by the way, encouraging me, hey, you know what? Why don't you come over and get a transfer and work in our offices in Shanghai for a while? You'd love it, right? You'll get paid as an American expat. They're not going to take your salary away from you, and you can live like a king here. And I said, that's fine, and so on and so forth. And then we talked about the Buicks. Oh, it was weird that all the people that I saw that were driving Buicks, they all had stick shifts, and none of them had automatics. And by the way, the cost of a Buick was more expensive in China than it was here in the US at the time. And after mentioning this 2 or 3 times, my colleagues kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, Truman, you just don't get it. And I said, yeah, I don't get it. And they said, if you're rich enough here to buy a Buick, you're rich enough to have a driver. Buick owners in China didn't do their own driving. So they didn't give a crap about whether it had an automatic or a stick shift because they had a chauffeur. Why? Because chauffeurs were cheap. Cooks were cheap. People told me, hey, look, if you move to China for the salary that they would pay Americans, because they're not going to take your salary away from you, you can afford to live in a really, really nice place, and you can afford to have a cook, and you can afford to have a chauffeur. And then when you buy a car, a nice big Buick, you'll care more about the back seat than you care about the driving experience, because you got a driver. Anyways, so that was one of the things. And the last thing I'm going to actually leave you with is just a little bit on the personal side. Okay, not my personal side, but having talked with some of my colleagues in China, okay, there were quite a number of women that were in the workforce. And one of the complaints that I heard the most was that the women in China that were working for GE, so relatively high paying jobs, right, had miserable personal lifestyles. Their personal life sucked. And they complained about not being able to really find good dates and mates. Why? Because the society is such that for a variety of different reasons, men refuse to marry or even date up. They marry and date down. They want to be the dominant one in the family, not the also ran, right? So they will not date someone or go out with somebody who is wealthier than they are or has a job that is more prestigious or bigger or better than what they have. Okay, so what we ended up with at GE, because we paid actually pretty well, and there were a lot of women that worked in that in management jobs at GE, was that those women were complaining that it was very, very difficult to find people who are willing to go out with them because they were too successful. Quite different society. anyways, those were a couple of just a few little tidbits from my days working as global pricing director and traveling around the country, around the world in that. Tomorrow, I'm going to post a little bit and we will talk a little bit about being in a professor. And as a professor, I spent one summer in Korea University in Seoul. And behind me here, you will see in my office, I've got a little coat that came from Albania, where I spent a semester as a Fulbright. And so we'll talk tomorrow a little bit about some of the learnings from those different countries, little tidbits of that. All right. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go. And I hope that you've enjoyed my little going off on a rail. Okay. With that, bye-bye.